The conference room fell silent the moment the glass shattered. A crystal tumbler hit the floor and burst into glittering shards at the feet of the only black woman in the room. 30 executives froze mid-movement, their designer suits catching the morning light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline of Manhattan gleamed behind them, sharp, cold, expensive. And in the center of the chaos stood Amina Daniels, clutching a stack of binders she'd been passing out. The CFO, Richard Holden, a man with a jaw carved like a stone statue and a voice that always sliced instead of spoke, pointed at her with a glare sharp enough to bruise. "Watch it," Richard snapped, stepping back dramatically. "That tumbler costs more than your monthly salary." A few chuckles bubbled in the room, not loud, but enough. Amina's breath caught, humiliation tightening around her ribs. She hadn't dropped the glass. She hadn't even touched the table. Richard had swept his arm too wide while bragging about quarterly projections and knocked it over himself. But now 30 pairs of eyes were on her. Because she was the assistant, the invisible one. The one people expected to clean up the mess, no matter who caused it. "I'll get it cleaned up," Amina murmured, kneeling to gather the glass with careful fingers. "Just be quick," Richard said. "We're trying to run a business, not a daycare." Laughter again, this time not even hidden. Amina felt heat creep up her throat, but she said nothing. She placed each shard into the small bin she carried. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from restraint. Behind her, 2 executives whispered, "Why do they even let assistants into executive briefings?" "She's here in case the projector stops working. That's her genius." Another snicker. Amina stood up slowly, smoothing her dark blazer, lifting her chin just an inch. She wasn't here for the projector. She wasn't here for the coffee she'd brewed at 6 a.m. She wasn't here for the binders or the note-taking or the silent tasks that defined the job nobody respected. She was here because she was the only one in the room who understood the full picture of the company's collapse. But they didn't know that yet. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a room full of powerful people who looked right through you? Have you ever handed someone the key to their success only to watch them treat you like part of the furniture? That was this room, a room suspended 50 floors above Manhattan, a room where the powerful devoured the powerless with their eyes, a room where wealth smelled like leather chairs, polished wood, and generational arrogance. This was Halden and Pierce Global Holdings, a Fortune 500 titan with marble floors, oil paintings of founders, and a culture built on legacy, on lineage, on connections, on families who had been rich so long, they forgot how to speak to someone who wasn't. Executives lined the table, heirs to empires, Ivy League alumni, men with watches that cost more than apartments. And Richard, self-appointed king of the 50th floor, was their crown prince. He straightened his cufflinks and looked down his nose at her. "Next time," he said, "stand farther from the table. You bump into things." Amina stared at him, stunned. She had been nowhere near the table, but the lie hung in the air like a stain no one bothered to wash. "I understand, sir," she said softly. He smirked, the smirk of a man who believed he could not be challenged. As Amina returned to her seat in the back, a woman in a red power suit leaned to her colleague. "She's lucky to even be in this building. Power imbalance, hierarchy, class, prestige. That's what this world worshipped. Not hard work, not intelligence, not talent. Just entitlement wrapped in expensive fabric." Amina placed her notebook on her lap, shoulders squared despite the sting. To the room, she was the assistant assigned to Richard's division. But nobody knew the truth about her. She wasn't an assistant, not originally. She had been an analyst, one of the youngest on the team, sharp, precise, tirelessly dedicated, until life hit her like a brick. The call had come 2 years ago. Her mother, stroke, sudden, severe. Amina left work that day, and the next day, and the next. She became caretaker, nurse, translator, advocate. The medical bills drained her savings, then drained everything else. By the time her mother stabilized, Halden and Pierce had restructured her role. A polite way to say, "We replaced you. Here's a lower role. Take it or leave the company." She took it. She couldn't afford not to. And that's how the woman who once ran models and audits now fetched coffee and typed meeting minutes. But the mind inside her, the mind that had built entire financial strategies, the mind that saw patterns in chaos, the mind trained by years of survival and responsibility, that mind hadn't dimmed. She still watched every chart, every report, every minor oversight the executives missed. And she saw something they were too arrogant to notice. The company was bleeding money. Quietly, dangerously, and the person responsible was sitting at the head of the table. Richard. He clicked to the next slide with smug confidence. "Quarterly losses are purely market fluctuations," he declared. "Temporary downturns." Amina's eyebrows twitched. Temporary? No. This was intentional miscategorization. Funds rerouted into shell accounts. Numbers massaged into illusions. She knew the signs. She had grown up watching her uncle lose his barbershop because someone skimmed off the books and he didn't catch it in time. She could see when numbers lied. Richard continued, "Audit results are pending, but I expect a smooth report." A smooth report? Was he out of his mind? Or did he truly believe no one noticed? An executive raised a hand. "Richard, some of these discrepancies..." "Handled," Richard snapped. "We're moving forward." Handled. Amina almost laughed. Handled meant covered, buried, manipulated. A tremor of anxiety rippled through her chest. Should she speak? No. Assistants didn't interrupt executives. Not in this world. Not in this empire carved from arrogance. She kept her head down. But life doesn't always wait for courage. The crisis broke in the next 10 minutes. A breathless junior accountant burst through the glass doors, face pale. "Sir, there's an emergency. The auditors flagged the assets. They're demanding clarification immediately." Executives gasped. Richard stiffened. What clarification? The accountant swallowed hard. Someone rewrote the internal transfer logs. Funds are missing. Silence cracked across the room. "Missing?" an executive whispered. "How much?" The accountant hesitated. 60 million. A collective intake of breath. Richard's face drained of color. But Amina froze because she had seen the pattern days ago. She had known something catastrophic was coming. And now the bomb had detonated. The conference room erupted. Executives shot out of their chairs. Papers scattered. Voices overlapped in panic. 60 million? How? Is this fraud? Who touched the accounts? Richard, explain this. But the CFO stood rigid, jaw clenched so hard the muscle twitched. His mind raced behind his eyes, calculating, panicking, hiding. He held up a hand. "Everyone sit. Down." The command cracked through the room. Slowly, reluctantly, the executives sank back into their seats. Richard took a breath, steadying himself. "The auditors must be mistaken. I'll contact them directly." The junior accountant stammered, "Sir, they're waiting on the line right now." Richard's glare silenced him. "Out. I'll handle it." The accountant fled. Amina kept perfectly still in her seat at the back, but her heart hammered. She saw the truth with terrible clarity. Richard wasn't confused. He wasn't blindsided. He knew. He caused this. And 60 million didn't disappear by accident. A voice sliced through the tension. "Shouldn't someone pull up the internal logs?" an executive asked. "We need transparency." "That's unnecessary," Richard said quickly. "My department already reviewed." "No, it isn't unnecessary," another executive snapped. "The board is arriving in 30 minutes. We need answers." The board. The real power. They weren't the pampered executives in this room. They were the titans whose signatures could end careers before lunch. Amina felt the air shift. Fear thickened it. A screen blinked to life. One executive, tired of Richard's evasions, connected to the internal system. "Pulling up the transfer logs now." "No," Richard barked. Everyone froze. He caught himself too late. His outburst said everything. The executive's eyes narrowed. "Why not, Richard?" Richard's mouth worked silently. Amina closed her eyes. This man was cornered, and cornered men with power were the most dangerous of all. She inhaled softly, bracing for the inevitable. The logs loaded. A single spreadsheet appeared, clean, polished, and deeply wrong. "This isn't right," the executive muttered. "There are entire days missing." "It's a glitch," Richard insisted. "We've had no glitches in 20 years, someone shot back. Another voice. "This looks altered." Altered. A shiver ran through the room. Executives looked at Richard, then at one another, then back again. Suspicion spread like fire through dry grass. And still, Amina stayed quiet, invisible, watching, waiting. She had known this day would come. She had warned the numbers. She had begged the spreadsheets for mercy. But the truth was already out. The door slammed open. The board entered. 5 members. Old money, old power. Sharp eyes, sharper judgment. At their center was Margaret Hawthorne, chairwoman, an industry legend. Her gray hair was pulled back, her suit immaculate, her gaze lethal. "What?" she said, voice icy. "Is happening?" Richard stood quickly. "There's a misunderstanding with the auditors, a technical glitch." "Sit," she ordered. He sat. Margaret's eyes scanned the room. Who can explain the discrepancy? Silence. No one dared speak, because no one wanted to be responsible for accusing the CFO, or for looking foolish if they were wrong. Margaret's voice dropped. "We are missing $60 million. Someone in this room knows why." Her gaze swept the table like a blade. But Amina saw something the board didn't. These executives were blind, not by incompetence, but by comfort. They didn't understand the files. They didn't read the numbers. They outsourced the thinking, and the only person in the room who truly knew what the logs meant was sitting in the shadows with a notebook in her lap. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever held the truth in your hands while watching powerful people choke on lies? Have you ever waited for someone, anyone, to ask the question only you can answer?" Margaret looked at every executive, one by one. "Who has reviewed the logs personally?" Murmurs, shifting eyes, no hands raised. Of course not. They didn't touch their own files. They had assistants, analysts, people like Amina. And that's when Margaret asked the question Amina never expected to hear. Someone in this building prepared these reports. Who was assigned to Halden's department? Executives looked around, and then several heads turned toward her. Amina's breath caught. Richard's eyes widened, not in fear, but in fury. Oh no, he was thinking. Not her, not the assistant, not the shadow. Margaret saw the attention shift and followed it. Her gaze landed on Amina. "And you are?" Amina stood slowly, palms damp, heartbeat in her throat. Amina Daniels, ma'am, she said quietly. Executive assistant to Mr. Halden. Richard cut in instantly. She doesn't have access to... Margaret lifted a single finger, silencing him. Amina, she said, do you know what happened to the missing funds? Amina hesitated. Speak? Stay silent? Expose herself? Expose Richard? She imagined her mother at home. Medicine bottles on the counter, Kane leaning against the fridge, the soft voice that always said, "If you know the truth, baby, don't let fear bury it." Amina exhaled. Yes, she said softly. I know exactly what happened. Gasps. Richard shot out of his chair. Margaret, she's overstepping. Sit, Margaret said again, voice iron. He sat. Amina stepped forward, out of the shadows, into the light. Her presence small only to the people who had never looked at her properly. She stopped beside the screen, took the remote, and switched to a hidden spreadsheet buried under the CFO's folder structure. The room collectively inhaled. 2 weeks ago, Amina said, voice steady, I noticed irregularities in the asset movement, transfers that made no mathematical sense. She highlighted a pattern, then another, then the shell accounts. These were manual overrides, she continued, all routed through the CFO's permissions. All eyes whipped to Richard. Margaret's expression hardened. Amina, she said, how did you access these? Because I used to be an analyst, Amina replied, before my role was restructured. Executives murmured, whispers, restructured. She was an analyst. She caught this? The air crackled. Richard exploded. This is ridiculous. She must have tampered with the file. Margaret's voice hit him like a hammer. Enough! He froze. She turned to Amina again, eyes sharp but searching. Show us the rest. Amina nodded. Her hands didn't shake, not anymore. She began to peel back the numbers, layer by layer, revealing the truth buried beneath. The missing assets, the forged signatures, the timing of transfers, the exact moment Richard rerouted funds to cover his earlier errors. With every reveal, gasps rippled across the room. Amina, one executive whispered, how did you see this? She looked at him with quiet strength. Because I learned growing up that numbers never lie, she said. Only people do. Silence. Powerful, heavy, undeniable. A lifetime of invisibility condensed into one moment of irrefutable truth. She stepped back. And in the heart of a Fortune 500 boardroom, everything shifted. The room was no longer breathing. Executives stared at Amina as if seeing her for the very first time. Margaret Hawthorne gripped the edge of the conference table, her eyes locked on the cascading data on the screen. Every chart, every timestamp, every fraudulent transfer Amina had uncovered. And then she turned her gaze, slow and deadly, toward Richard. Is there anything, she said, voice cold as steel, you'd like to say before we proceed? Richard's throat bobbed. He rose from his seat, fists curling as panic warped his face. This is absurd, he hissed. She's a secretary, an assistant with no clearance, no authority. She's framing me to save her job. Amina kept her expression calm. She had heard this tone her entire life. Men who believed volume equaled truth. Men who believed title excused anything. Margaret didn't flinch. Amina, she said softly, is he lying? Amina tapped the keyboard. A second spreadsheet appeared. This one was worse. Not only was the money rerouted under his permissions, she said, but several signatures were digitally replicated using a pattern consistent with the CFO's login key. room erupted again. Digital forgery. Inside a Fortune 500. Richard's knees nearly buckled. Margaret folded her hands. "Security will escort Mr. Halden." "You can't do this," Richard roared, pointing at Amina. "She's nobody. She's a shadow in this company. She fetches coffee. She organizes files. She is not qualified to accuse me of—" A voice from the far end of the table cut him off. "Amina," an executive said slowly, "how did you find all of this?" She turned, eyes all on her, every pair now filled with disbelief, awe, or something deeper, respect. Amina took a breath. "I'm the one who built the original model," she said. "The audit system the company still uses." Gasps. Executives exchanged stunned looks. She continued, "I created the algorithm that flags irregular financial activity. I designed the triggers that track unauthorized access. Even after my position was changed, I stayed familiar with the parameters." Her voice steadied, quiet, controlled, but powerful enough to cut through marble walls. "I don't fetch coffee," she said. "I fetch the truth from numbers no one else bothers to look at." Margaret leaned back, eyes narrowing with new understanding. "You built the model," she repeated slowly. "You created the core financial integrity program?" Amina nodded once. Richard's face drained, realizing the ground he stood on had turned to dust. But Margaret wasn't done. "Then why," she asked, "are you an assistant?" The room fell silent, not with guilt, but with collective shame. Amina lifted her chin. "My mother had a stroke," she said. "I left for several months to care for her. When I returned, my role had been restructured. But I still needed the job. I still needed health insurance. I still needed to pay bills." Her eyes flicked to Richard, and some people prefer their shadows to stay in the dark. A long, painful silence. Richard lunged toward her. "This is slander." Security seized him instantly. 2 guards appeared seemingly from nowhere, each gripping an arm. Margaret stood. "Mr. Halden," she said, "you are relieved of all duties effective immediately. The board will begin formal investigation and legal proceedings." Richard struggled, shouting, "You'll regret this. You'll regret believing her." Margaret's reply was ice. "I regret not seeing her sooner." Security dragged him out, his shouts echoing down the polished hallway until the doors slammed shut behind him. Silence washed over the conference room, raw, electric. Then all eyes turned back to Amina. And she stood in the center of the room, no longer invisible, no longer the assistant ignored in the corner, no longer the woman collecting broken glass off the floor. She stood like someone the world had just discovered. Margaret approached her, steps slow, measured, respectful. "Amina Daniels," she said, "you saved this company from a catastrophe." Executives nodded almost involuntarily. "You uncovered what none of us could," she continued. "You saw what the systems, the audits, and the executives missed." Amina swallowed hard. Margaret paused, her expression softening. "We need someone who understands the company at its core," she said. "Someone who sees the fine print, the cracks, the warning signs." She extended her hand. "We need a new chief financial officer." A breath punched out of the room. Executives stared, some in awe, some in disbelief, some with a haunted expression of people watching history rewrite itself. Right in front of them. Amina blinked. "Me?" she whispered. "Ma'am, I'm not—" Margaret smiled. "You're not a shadow, not anymore." "But the board agrees," Margaret said simply. "Unanimously." Amina's pulse thrummed painfully. This couldn't be real. A Fortune 500 CFO? Her? The girl who learned to pay bills before she learned to ride a bike? The daughter of a mother who raised her alone on a postal worker's salary? The assistant who fetched coffee for executives wearing watches worth more than her yearly income? She stared at Margaret's hand. Then she saw something else. The executives around the table rising to their feet, not standing in protest, standing in respect. One of them said softly, "Congratulations." Another, "It's deserved." Another, "We should have seen this before." Amina exhaled, eyes burning. She took Margaret's hand. When she spoke, her voice trembled with a power she had always carried, but no one had ever listened to. "I accept." A wave of applause broke out, raw, human, not the polite kind that followed quarterly presentations. This was recognition. This was gratitude. This was redemption. Margaret squeezed her hand. "Gather your things. Your new office is 2 doors down from mine." Amina almost laughed, half joy, half disbelief. As she stepped back, the room seemed to glow differently, warmer, clearer, as if the ceiling itself had lifted to let her breathe. Executives surrounded her, shaking her hand, offering congratulations, asking for her insights, as if she were suddenly fluent in a language they only now realized she'd been speaking all along. And then, the woman in red, who'd mocked her earlier, pushed through the crowd. She cleared her throat. "Amina," she said quietly, "I misjudged you." Amina smiled gently. "I know," she said. The woman blushed, nodding with a mixture of shame and respect. Later that evening, long after the board meeting ended and the sun cast gold reflections on the marble lobby, Amina stepped out of the revolving doors into the warm Manhattan air. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "How was your day, baby? Did they finally see you the way I do?" Tears pricked Amina's eyes. She typed back, "They did, Mama. They finally did." She looked up at the towering glass building, her building now, and breathed in the city air like it belonged to her. Because it did. Because she had taken the shadows and turned them into a spotlight. Because she had turned humiliation into revelation. Because she had turned injustice into power. Because she had turned silence into a voice the board couldn't ignore. Let me leave you with this. People will underestimate you because of your job, your clothes, your origins, your silence. They will place you in corners that make them comfortable. They will call you assistant, background, help, shadow, and they will expect you to stay there. But what they forget is this. Shadows only exist when there is light behind them. And sometimes, the person they pushed into the darkness is the one born to lead the entire company into the light. The black woman who worked in the shadows became the head of the Fortune 500 because the truth she carried was brighter than every chandelier in that boardroom.